I'm really excited for the next part of our discussion, which is going to be a fireside chat, followed by a Q&A where all of you guys get to ask questions as well. So I'm going to put the QR code up here one more time so you guys can start thinking about your questions. And as you do that, I want to introduce the BetaKit editor-in-chief, Douglas Soltys, whose entire bio just says Douglas spends too much time on the internet. So please join me in welcoming Douglas. Today, Douglas has the honor of talking to Jack Newton, the CEO of Clio. He is a pioneer in cloud-based legal technology. He has spearheaded efforts to educate the legal community on the security, ethics, and privacy issues surrounding cloud computing, and has become a nationally recognized author and speaker on these topics. Jack has set some ambitions for himself and for Clio to transform the practice of law for good, and for over a decade, his commitment has been unwavering in that work. I'm really excited for this conversation. Jack, please join us up here.
Does your microphone say 2 on it?
Yes.
Then we are ready to begin. Let's go. Okay. I want to thank you for doing this because I think
happy to be here.
Awesome. Yeah. Hi, everybody.
Good to see everyone.
This is a really cool room, and I love the overflow, and I wish we could take this room across the country and do 1,000 of these. I think you are the perfect person to continue the conversation that we kind of kicked off in a fever dream in May, because you've got at least 16 years in the game. You're one of those multi-decade people that the young person on the stage before acknowledged and maybe kind of shamed. There's a lot of gray beards at the dinner last night, and we were all both like being seen and attacked by acknowledging that. But it means that your perspective is really, really earned, which is why we're having this conversation. I think you've demonstrated to me that you care about the tech community both locally and nationally. The TLDR of like how this event happened is that we grabbed coffee in Toronto after we did the town hall in Toronto. And Jack was like, yeah, would really love to like participate if you ever guys do a thing again. And I was playing it cool. I was trying to be like, yeah, well, we'll keep that in mind. I really appreciate that. And I'm just like quietly texting Siri and Satish on the side being like, he's in, we're doing this. When do I tell him? And then months later, we're here. But also I think, like, as Siri kind of noted, much of the national conversation right now when it comes to tech, whether we admit it or not, whether we say the name out loud, is like, how do we get more Shopifys? And I think Clio is probably, particularly at this moment in time, probably one of the best examples of a company moving towards that outcome and not following the same path. And there's a lot to learn from, which we're going to dig into here. But we're not going to start with that because I want to note a couple things. First, all of you that were doing Slido questions for the Vantage Point panel, thank you. That's never happened before. We didn't scope for that. So maybe we will try to get those questions answered by our panelists later. If not, we're going to have profiles of all of them dropping on the site next week, and maybe we can get those questions answered there. But I also wanted to just even like get your reaction to that panel conversation, and if there's something that resonates, and then we'll carry it forward. I would maybe say first, BetaKit is a small business. We're a small business media publication, so like small SMB conversations are totally within the bounds of entrepreneurship. I think that's really important. And then second, Solen Angel, who flew here from either Ottawa or Ibiza, I'm not really sure because he hasn't. There you go, both. Noted something to me on the last panel that like we had someone on this stage mention that their company had publicly listed on the NASDAQ, and no one in the room batted an eye. And I think maybe could we like backfill the round of applause for Upselera for. I know the vibes on the best coast are chill, but that was a little surprising. But also, I think we're going to maybe interrogate whether or not that's a good thing or like how that happens and whatever. But so that out of the way, anything coming from those perspectives that you want to jump into and start with?
Well, I think It was an incredible panel, really enjoyed the conversation, and it all resonated with me. There's nothing that was said that I'd say I disagree with, and probably, for the most part, vehemently agree with everything that was said on the panel. I think the panel also highlighted something I always find to be the case in Vancouver, which is like, holy shit, I didn't know there was that cool company building something right in our own backyard. And it happens way too frequently that I'm in San Francisco, or I'm in, even Dublin for Web Summit, or some far-flung place in the world, and run into another Vancouver entrepreneur. And it's the first time I've met them, and often the first time I've heard about their company. And I just think we need way more of this, and way more of those types of panel conversations, and way more. I think Siri talked about the idea of storytelling, and I think just that storytelling is so powerful because it lets other people see what's possible and kind of believe in themselves, and hopefully pursue that dream that they've maybe been pushing pause on so far. So I thought it was very inspiring, and there's a bunch of new voices for me on that panel that it was great to hear from. So kudos, it was fantastic. Maybe let's hear another round of applause for that panel. It was fantastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, patent pending on our Vantage Points talk show approach to just letting everyone hold court for 10 minutes.
Storytelling with BetaKit.
Storytelling. But okay, so I just want to follow this through because I know we were going to talk about community at some point, and even like when we grabbed coffee and you hard pitched us on doing a town hall here. Yeah, absolutely, we just would not let it go. I don't know, the room was a little quiet. I'm going to try to lighten it up. I'm also like existing on both like Toronto and Vancouver time zones, so I've just been awake for 36 hours. When we were talking about that before, you were like, yes, community important. There was coming from the Toronto Town Hall, there was this sense of, oh man, it has been 4 years since everyone's been in a room together.
Yeah.
And some of the faces have changed, and it's good to see people coming back and new faces. We did a dinner last night with some of the panelists and just people in the community, and it was kind of like split, divided between, what was the term that we use? The graybeards, the people who have multi-decades in the space, and then some net new entrants. Is it just the storytelling, or is it like literally the collision, the impact, the sense of?
Yeah, it's the community. I think when we met up in Toronto and had that coffee, one of the comments I had was just exactly what I just shared, which was it feels like I'm running into Canadian entrepreneurs down in the valley, overseas, all over the U.S., but never in our own backyard. And I think it's just a missed opportunity for us to be spending more time together, connecting in person. And I feel like we're still in a little bit of a recovery phase post-COVID, finding our groove on that again. And so it's one of the reasons I was really excited to make this happen, is I feel like these kind of gatherings are, number one, very overdue, and something I think we need to be doing in a much more regular cadence. And I think it's that, one of the concepts I talk about a lot at Clio is the idea of a flywheel, right? And I'm sure most people here have read Jim Collins' Good to Great book. And he talks about this concept of a flywheel and just how you get this virtuous cycle happening where the more inputs you have, the more impact you're able to generate. The example he uses is Amazon, right? The reason Amazon has become such an unstoppable machine is they're able to draw the most consumers to the site. They're able to draw, in turn, the most merchants, who in turn want to sell to the largest audience, and they get the scale so they can sell at the lowest prices, which in turn draws more consumers that want to buy more products at lower prices. And these kinds of virtuous flywheels, I think, exist everywhere. And they exist both at the microcosm level, like right here in Vancouver. They exist at the Canada-wide level. And I think we need to be thinking about what kinds of things can we do to drive that innovation flywheel, to drive that entrepreneurship flywheel, both locally and across the country. And I think it's events like this that maybe in a very imperceptible way are helping feed that energy. And it's the strength of weak connections that I think ends up really powering that community. And you need events like this. This is not something that ever gets created in a virtual environment. Like, this gets created in the flesh with people getting to connect in person, and that's enormously powerful when you can make it happen.
Yeah, I completely agree, and like having attended some of those Zoom events and maybe hosted a few, there's like a tangible difference. I also even just think it's interesting you use Amazon as an example, but like for like what we're trying to do here, and the reason why we felt so welcomed and are energized by this is like the flywheel is actually moved by people. And I think it was Allison that said something on the panel previously about like keeping it going forward with this idea of momentum. That like the first 0 to 5 million was really difficult, and then it kind of got easier. I can't remember what.
Yeah, I think Ali made that comment.
50 to 100 million got a little bit easier.
It's just cruise control after that.
Okay, jeez.
Easy button.
You're such a soft-spoken guy, but I can just, there's an edge to that statement that like when you hit 200 million ARR, you're like, yeah, I can say that. That's safe. But how much of that is driven, because there's also conversation about like, we have young people in the community and like there are other people here, our after party is being run by someone who also wants to connect. And like their asks seem so basic to me as someone who is now, on the other side of 40 that they're just like, do you have space and maybe a little bit of mentorship and time and things like that? At the early stage of Clio, is it actually like a financial need? Is it a technical need? Like what got the wheel moving? Was it literally just people?
Yeah, it's people, but it's again the strength of those weak connections that you don't necessarily anticipate. Ali and I were talking about this a little bit before the session, and one of the investors that came in on Jane's latest round got to know Jane because they were in town for a Clio board meeting, and had to kill the afternoon. And like, are we going to stare at the wall in our hotel room, or are we going to go see some companies in Vancouver? And they went and visited a number of companies. One of them was Jane, and they ended up leading the investment round in Jane. For Clio, the story is, our first real institutional capital from the US was Bessemer Venture Partners. And one of the reasons Bessemer was comfortable investing in Clio was because they just, a couple years prior, had invested in Shopify. And it was one of the partners that was like, yeah, I've kind of figured out this whole Canada thing with Shopify. This was way before Shopify IPO'd, and Shopify was probably a 100-person company at that point. But it was just the fact that even this company on the other side of the country and a founder in the form of Toby that had kind of blazed this trail for us that we were able to slipstream behind, and that led to Bessemer leading our Series C. And again, I don't think that would have been possible if they hadn't previously seen some success with Shopify. So you see this flywheel kind of building momentum across the country, and in what is often imperceptible ways to the outside observer, but it's these small little relationships and unlocks that end up creating the next Shopify or the next Clio.
You can kind of be dragging off that even if the person in front of you doesn't even know that you're
providing.
Yeah,
like I'm sure Toby had no idea that I was like slipstreaming in behind Shopify there and leveraging some of the same relationships. And it just, I think that happens, at scale when you're doing a good job of building that flywheel.
Well, everyone in this room now knows like the value of like when a VC comes to visit Clio. So like, please take note. Schedule your.
You can just hang out outside our offices, try to catch them on the way out.
We are the Clio of. Okay, let's. There was some other things I want that were maybe touched upon, addressed when we talk about creating the flywheel moving or powered by people that we maybe take for granted or forget are like human driven as well. The election. Still no government. We were promised a government to show up. It's not happened. But there were also conversations about like federal perspectives, provincial perspectives, money exchanging hands. I didn't really know that Pacifican wasn't deploying as much capital as FedDev, but like BetaKit might write about that. So thank you for the tip. And then Ken Sim is known nationally as like the Vancouver mayor who is supporting tech, maybe in the way that Mayor Tory was, former Mayor Tory was a few years past. Maybe I'm going to do this, a little audience participation before I ask you the questions and warm this up a little bit. Show of hands, how many people voted in the election over the weekend? At dark, I actually can't see, but I'm assuming, no lies, so front row, all voted.
It was most of the room, and I think this province-wide stat was 57% turnout, which is pretty good. On an atmospheric river day, yeah.
Yeah. You are now at the level where I'm pretty sure you have the capacity to garner maybe attention that the other people on this panel like have want or fought for or looking to achieve. How and when we've talked privately, I know you've had some reactions to statements made or perception of this ecosystem when it comes to like different approaches provincially and federally. Do you want to talk a little bit about how at this stage you approach engaging with government, either for the benefit of Clio or as a representative of Canadian tech? And then I'll let you name any names that you want to name as you go through that.
Well, I'll try to, just maybe zooming out at the very highest level. I found, Ali made a comment along these lines that resonated with me as well. But it seems like in the very initial stages of building something, when you need support, the government's not there. And I found that in Clio, where I felt like we got, we started fundraising in 2008, which I know feels like a geological epoch ago, but it was in the middle of the global financial crisis, and it was an enormously difficult time to raise money, and I think that's the time where you need some level of support, ideally from government, to kind of spark that innovation, get those gestational ideas off the ground. And then I find that after a certain point, I think the government support actually becomes maybe not even useless, but actually anti-productive, in that it can keep companies that shouldn't be alive for too long, that are basically, we've probably all heard the term like shred zombies and other kinds of companies that would otherwise go out of business if it wasn't for basically this government-sponsored support program in the form of shred, which again I think is doing a lot of good in some areas, and again letting companies that maybe should in a totally free market environment fail stay alive for years and years and years just off of that program. So I think number one, we need to reevaluate how we're deploying. Like shred is $4 billion a year of spend. Is that being deployed in absolutely the best way possible today? I think that's an emphatic no. I'm sure any entrepreneur in the room that has had to go through the shred process feels like pulling their hair out. 16 years ago, I had a lot of hair. And it's this like the whole fact there's a whole cottage industry of consultants that need to help navigate companies through that program is probably a signal that and in looking at that program, I always thought this is absolutely geared towards a life sciences company, not a technology. It's like software company. And it was interesting hearing Ann comment that it doesn't even feel like it works well for a life sciences company.
But look, so you just gave two-sided criticisms of a federal program that contributes a huge amount of capital. So I want to, and noting that program has been under review for like 2 years. So
yeah,
there's this shred review of the shred review of the shred review that we've covered. But it's interesting that the conversation is, this is both a boondoggle that too many people are taking advantage of, or keeping those zombie companies alive, or the branch plants are taking advantage of it because they have like Canadian domiciled divisions that are just covering the talent here so they can then move them to Palo Alto. But then it's also like, but it's not available to the other companies that need it based upon their sector. And I want to ladder that up and say, or ask, what is then the expectation that this ecosystem should have to engage with the government for programs, access to capital at all? Because we can fine-tune the disbursements, the levers, the approaches. There was heated debate at a very loud dinner table last night about the best pathway to do that, even towards like, has anyone built a spreadsheet of the MPs that are cool? I don't know if that's going to work, but it was suggested. But like, I just want to even talk about whether you think that time and attention to engage with that is worthwhile or a distraction. Either now at the stage that you're at, where you might actually be called and asked your opinion on these things, on a stage such as this, or back when you were just hoping that someone would notice or have a program for you.
Well, I think that if you can't depend on the government support in any way, shape, or form, and often when it finally starts I think especially in the early stage. So this is what I'm saying is kind of the tension is, it feels like when you need that support most, it's least available. And then it seems like the funds start flowing maybe when you found product market fit, you're scaling, you can get external funding, and you're kind of off to the races. So I think if the government is looking at this, like if I was PM and thinking, how do I position Canada to win in this like innovation economy? We've got a situation where capital flows more freely around the world than it ever has. So investment will go to wherever the great companies are. So then the question becomes, how do we make Canada the place that the most great companies are being created? And I think it's, you look at it like a growth marketer would look at something and say, like, I'm going to experiment like hell. And I'm going to try a lot of different things. And I don't know where the next BlackBerry or the next Shopify or the next great technology company is going to come, but I know that I can do a lot of experiments and see what sticks. And I would think about, how do I foster an environment that is seeing a lot of experiments being driven at the very early stages? How do I make this the most attractive environment to found a company? And how do I make this the most amazing place for employees of those companies to choose to live? Because again, talent is more mobile than it's ever been as well. And I think Canada has a right to build itself into this world-leading location for innovation, but we need to look at our taxes. We need to look at how we can lower personal income tax and make it a more attractive place for employees. We need to make it a place where it's the best place for founders to found a company. And I was extremely disappointed and frustrated with the capital gains inclusion rate change earlier this year, and I know many people in the room were also frustrated by that, but I think it's essentially a tax on innovation. And we need to look at how, of these billions of dollars of government funds we're deploying, how we can best target the early stage and nurture the early stage of companies that might get them into that stage where they can raise a Series A or even a seed stage round. And I think once you've done that, government funding should play a very minimal role in getting the company to the next stage. I think customers, product market fit, the free market venture investors will pull the company into the later stages of success.
Okay. You did a really good job of getting through all that without naming any names, which I'm impressed and disappointed by. But I want to talk then about the nature of how that conversation is facilitated. And the point is well taken. Speaking to a lot of people here over the week, it seems like a lot of the discomfort comes from a position of saying, hey, we have constructive criticism about how these programs work. And then the reception to that is you are tax avoiding, selfish people that don't want to participate.
Yeah.
On the other side, this collective of people seem to think that the solution is always, why don't you just be more like startups? Why don't you have a diverse portfolio, run a lot of experiments, rapidly iterate? And I think it's a common saying from Shopify president Harley Finkelstein that entrepreneurship is a great form of problem solving, but is government not a different form of problem solving, and do those things mix? So I'm wondering how you think we should present this argument in a way that would be most effectively received, because it doesn't seem like the relationship is a little taut right now.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think for the government, a good North Star would be to kind of look at the entrepreneurship and the ecosystem, the way doctors look at a patient, and the maxim that first do no harm. And I think you look at a lot of the policies that have come out in the last year. I think you can say these objectively harm our odds at building a thriving startup ecosystem. I don't think the government should be in the business of necessarily trying to pick winners or do any of the things, again, that the free market has shown that it's pretty great at. Thinking about this flywheel, again, and as a metaphor, the government should think about, there's investment dollars, there's employees, there's talent feeding all these great things in this flywheel. And government policies can either reduce or increase friction in that flywheel. And I think if they just obsess about how do I eliminate friction in this flywheel? How do I change our tax policies? How do I change our company formation laws? How do I make it easier for US-based investors to invest in Canada or for international investors to invest in Canada? How do I make it easier for talent to move to Canada and choose Canada as their place? I think where the government gets kind of wound around the axle is in trying to pick winners and trying to allocate capital.
Like they're trying to start the movement rather than ensuring
and
that
maybe
it continues.
Capital allocation is not the problem. Like if you've got a great company in Canada, and I do think this has changed in the last 15 years. And again, Ali, you made the observation, like I haven't heard people talk about asking you to move your company to the Bay Area. We heard about that, 15 years ago at Clio, but I haven't heard anyone talk about that in the last 5 years. Like I think that's, if you're, the problem is that VCs will never tell you no in straight terms. And so they might tell you no, you're too far away, you're not in the Bay Area, but they're just lying to you. If you're a great company, they will invest you regardless of where you are in Canada. And that's more true today than it's ever been. So I think the government should just kind of try to get out of the way, obsess about minimizing friction in all the parts of forming and scaling companies, of bringing talent into Canada, and let the rest of us figure out the other aspects of the problem. But they have a really meaningful, important role to play in making Canada's flywheel spin. And they should just be thinking about, is the policy we're releasing, the taxation plan we're releasing, the changes we're implementing, either reducing or increasing friction in this flywheel? Yeah. And if they just obsess about reducing friction, I think we'll be in a world of a better place.
Yeah, I think that's that's a point well taken. To note on the being asked to move component, that's definitely something that we would hear a lot, maybe a little bit more than 5 years ago, like pre-COVID, 7 years ago, where like a requirement of the funding was that you had to reincorporate in the States. We do not even hear really whispers of that anymore. What we are hearing is people proactively being like, we're out. We're proactively taking our company down. We're tired of the circumstances, XYZ. It's just so much easier in SF. And I think we could dig into that if you want, if there are questions about that in the Q&A. I just got the 5-minute warning. We are definitely going a little bit over. I am drunk with power on the stage, but we can get to that in the Q&A. But I think maybe where I want to dig in and anchor this, I think these people in this room right now are mostly people that have decided to stay and build here. And I think we're well suited to hone and enhance the conversation for that group of people than the people that decided to be somewhere else. So that said, I want to talk about the state of play and then how your company is an amazing counterpoint to what's going on. So allow me to just set some context, and then we're going to talk about all the ways that you have like matrix dodged those scenarios,
sure.
Or thoughtfully moved around them. So, we've been talking, we just celebrated a company that was actually able to list on the NASDAQ, but for most other Canadian tech companies, the IPO window firmly shut in 2021. And I know that we were actually talking to you about that CFO that you hired that was like, we will IPO at any time when the moment is right, and the moment has not been right for a while.
Did I actually say that?
No, your CFO did.
Okay.
Yeah, I went back and checked. Shout outs, Josh Scott.
It's like, I'm sure my PR people said never say that.
Yeah, totally. CFO though, just cowboy. We are seeing more companies return to private and be public. Like BetaKit, I think, covered like a baker's dozen this year. Both Lightspeed and just this morning, Dye & Durham, topical, have noted that they're looking to explore a sale to go private. It's the worst, back to the venture story, the worst year in a decade for venture fundraising. And we're seeing those VC firms that have deployed capital here, incredibly poor performance from like Georgian and BDC. Their funds are not performing, and the valuations of the companies are being written down. You, sir, have been able to raise a metric junk ton of capital from all US VCs. While you have been ready to IPO since your CFO dropped that baller quote on BetaKit, you have not pursued that. You've had massive secondaries that have allowed you to refresh your cap table and navigate this. You're at 200 million ARR, so you're making money. You are not one of those zombie companies that in raising venture was then forced to try and reach that or make those layoffs, which we've seen FreshBooks just in the last month, or locally like Hootsuite, I'm sorry to say. Where does this start? What decision led to the others? Is it the fundraising component? Is it how you've went to market? Like,
Yeah.
Which data point triggers to the following?
Well, I'd say some elements of our kind of survival and trajectory over the last 16 years was forged in 2008 when we founded the company, and again tried to raise money, tried to build a company in the depths of the global financial crisis. And I think that imbued Clio with a sense of scrappiness and thriftiness even that survives to this day, where we've never been a growth at all costs company. Even though we've raised well over $1 billion at this point, the vast majority of those funds have flowed back to our investors and flowed back to our employees. And we've burned a vanishingly small portion of that $1 billion in building the company. Like our actual primary burn has been remarkably small. So I think that scrappiness has been part of it, and being really deliberate around how we refresh our cap table along the way as well. So I think,
What does that enable? Just to parse out for people who have not been at that fundraising stage or that decision point. Is
Yeah,
it just
happy to speak to that.
Like, is it what is it giving you to be that scrappy?
Well, it's actually giving your investors optionality, which is the important part. So a huge amount of what we talk about in startup land is like raising that first round, raising your first $1 million. And if it's any consolation, that first $1 million is the hardest to raise. And kind of like revenue, the next 999 million is relatively easy. But that first million is super hard. But what people don't really explain is, if you don't happen to IPO in that first, 7-8 years, which again, a vanishingly small number of companies are going to IPO in that 7 years now, especially with the threshold for even being a viable IPO candidate now is, depending on who you talk to, anywhere from $400 million to $1 billion of ARR to be a viable IPO today. So I think this is one of the reasons you commented that the IPO market, the public markets are extremely challenging right now. And over the last 10 years, just in my time at Clio, in the last 10 years, that threshold to IPO used to be $100 million. You hit $100 million at ARR, you can IPO, and there's a bunch of great companies like Zendesk, and I think even Shopify IPO just over $100 million of ARR. And
then doubled their revenue every year for the next 3 to justify the growth.
Right. Exactly. And you've seen, now that threshold get up to, 500 million plus, and you see, I think especially for Canada, the whole class of 2021 IPOs that kind of went, and that problem you're highlighting, by the way, it wasn't just a Canadian problem. That's a North American problem. Every company that went out in 2021 is really struggling in the public markets because they went out at a massively high multiple. They went out at a zero interest rate environment, and now obviously it's a totally different world.
Much like every firm that invested in them prior.
Right. So let me get back to the first $1 million. So you raise your first $1 million. You've got institutional investors on the cap table. You raise more money, maybe you raise the next $10 million. And now you're 7 or 8 years into building your company. And what I didn't realize as a young founder, and I think what a lot of people don't appreciate setting out onto a longer term journey, is every single one of those investors, every single one of those VCs invested out of a fund. And those funds have lifetimes, and those lifetimes are often 8 to 12 years. So somewhere inside of a decade, your VC is going to start looking for liquidity. And what this causes, I think, when we talk about a lot of companies selling too early, it's actually, if you look at when that happens, it's often around these milestones where their investors are aging out of their funds and they're trying to create liquidity, and often pressuring either indirectly or directly the founder to sell. And one message I wanted to share, in this talk was, if you do get to that point, and I hope there's a lot of people in this room that are at that point or eventually going to get to that point, you don't need to sell. You can look at the private markets as a way of creating liquidity for letting your existing investors punch out. And we saw this around our Series D. This is when TCV and JMI came on board, and they invested $250 million in Clio. And again, a significant portion of that was secondary to create liquidity for our existing investors, some of which had been in the company for 10 years at that point, some even a little bit longer. And the message I was able to send to my investors with this secondary interest from the private markets was, look, we're going to hunker down and we're going to go and grow this thing for the next 5 years. I don't want a peep about liquidity from anybody for the next 5 years. So if you want to sell all of your holdings or just a portion of your holdings or none of your holdings, you can roll it all. Make a choice, but you need to make that choice. And what I've found is that the private markets and the amount of money in the private markets today essentially allow you to do an on-demand IPO, create that liquidity for your shareholders and for your employees.
Release that pressure.
Release that pressure and set yourself up for the next stage of the journey. And not only that, but bring on a new set of strategic partners that have experience helping take companies from where we're at today at 250 million of ARR to 500 and then $1 billion of ARR. And that stepping stone, that progression is something that they've seen, they pattern match. They've seen it before and they can help plug in and help you through that scaling journey. And if you look at what we did on our Series F, which was $900 million US, that's multiple times the size of the average IPO. And we did it entirely in the private market without any of the turbulence that you see happening in the public markets.
Or the pressure that the CEOs of Dye & Durham and Lightspeed might be under right now to try and figure that out. Okay, I got one more. There's two other things that you've done that are really interesting that I want you to break down that detailed way, and I swear to God we're going to get to this Q&A. I swear. But I'll maybe tie these together, and you can answer the one you think is most interesting, and maybe someone in the Q&A will tie it back. Because not only have you chosen this interesting path for financing and growth to give yourself that optionality and provide optionality to your investors, you also, after banging your head against the Canadian market, very much decided to sell outside of Canada, even to the point of like charging in USD. Yeah. But you also have built this international exec team. You have a bunch of different locations around the world, and you have 2 different hubs in Canada, yeah, both here and in Toronto. And you said something very interesting to me about like you kind of need to be in 2 major Canadian cities to scale. Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, dealer's choice, pick one that you feel is most impactful for this audience to kind of give them the playbook. And this is just me like trying to put leverage on the Q&A. Please ask about the other thing that Jack doesn't speak to. But like, what can you kind of lay out in that the decision-making process that led to that?
Well, maybe I'll try to answer both and pull Donald Trump and kind of weave it all together. So I think number one, I'm intensely patriotic, and a big part of how I wanted to build Clio was I want to build a Canadian company. I want to show that we can build great companies in Canada. I want to show we can build great companies in BC, and that we can build great companies in Vancouver. But I also realized that as you really start to hit scale, you're not going to be able to do that in any one city in Canada, other than maybe Toronto. So I think if once you hit, call it 100 million ARR, and you start hitting that scale, and you need to start finding that talent that has seen the next stage of the journey, you're probably going to have to broaden your aperture to operating in at least a couple Canadian cities. And for us, that's today Vancouver, Calgary, where we've got a development office, and Toronto. And our Toronto office is actually in the near term going to probably surpass our Vancouver office in terms of headcount. And it's just there's probably 4 or 5 times more kind of qualified employees to hire up in Toronto. But
you don't seem to have a lot of existential dread about that. Can you talk about just like giving yourself the permission to do that versus maybe trying to just sole source it here, doing the RIM example of building, like I worked in RIM 20, it was like, and then they just started going to letters, it was weird. Like all of those buildings, or what we've seen with other companies.
Well, maybe it'll, this can segue into your I think is your first question, which was, the thing that takes priority over everything else and that very quickly flattens any sense of pride I might have of location or anything else is the company surviving and the company thriving, ideally. And I will, in a heartbeat, make any hire, regardless of geography, if I think they're going to be an impactful add to the team. So to that end, one of the things we've done over the last few years especially is again, you start looking at this story of going from 250 million ARR to $1 billion of ARR. There are just not that many Canadian companies to hire from with executives that have gone through that phase of the growth story. So I think one of the superpowers we've had here in Vancouver is, we're in the same time zone as San Francisco. And, I've been surprised at how important time zone is. Like, Ali, you were talking about like Toronto feeling far away and an exec being concerned about how far away it is. It's not the distance, it's the 3 hours. And, you realize that actually like really compresses the amount of time you have to collaborate. And it's not that it can't work, but it requires a lot of deliberate thought in terms of how you engineer an organization that can actually span that size of a time zone range. And for us, we've seen a lot of success recruiting in San Francisco. It's such an easy flight to get between SF and Vancouver. They're in the same time zone.
Seattle's 2 hours away.
Seattle's another great hub to be hiring from. So for us, there's, our DNA is Canadian, but if it's going to help increase the odds that we can build a terrific company, hiring out of the U.S. or hiring elsewhere in Canada, we'll do that in a heartbeat. And back to your first question, our patriotic ambitions even occurred in the early days of our go-to-market strategy in 2008. We were hopeful that we could start selling Clio to BC lawyers, and then there's a BC lawyer back there. Yes. Unfortunately, he didn't laugh at me in 2008, and I had to find out the hard way that BC lawyers didn't want to buy. We then went to Ontario, likewise got laughed out of the room. And me and Ryan, my co-founder, were down to like our last $10,000 in the bank account and took a kind of YOLO bet on going down to the ABA Tech Show in Chicago in March of 2008. And the reception we had there was just incredible, like this complete 180 to the experience we're having trying to sell Clio in Canada. And at that point, we were like, okay, we're all in on the US. Like this is our market. And we're going to ignore the Canadian market for now. And maybe the Canadian market will eventually come around, but we're all in on the US. And so I think the number one thing, a startup needs to be focused on is survival. And that's, what we did in those days. And I think whether it's deciding where you're hiring your talent or which market you're running after, survival needs to come first.
Okay, so practically patriotic.
Yeah, I like that. Practically patriotic.
Plus a little bit of great customer support, and we've got a new narrative about Canadian tech. Okay, we got to get to the Q&A. The way that we're going to do this is that we will have a mic going around, allowing people in the room to ask some questions, but then also give time for people to submit more questions to the Slido. I have that pulled up here. I'm already seeing a couple. This will be good, but we're going to give, I think Siri, excellent. Boris was like first.
I've got a really easy one for Jacka. Hey, Boris.
God. Boris was one of the graybeards last night, too. Self-acknowledged.
Good to see you. I grew a beard maybe just to show I've got gray hairs in it.
Hello. Really important question for you as you think about your place in Vancouver and BC and Canadian tech. Do you still have a fake office address at the end of place so that you can say Vancouver instead of Burnaby?
That is a sharp elbowed question, Boris. But I think we finally did away with our 999 Canada Way address. Proudly have a Burnaby, BC address today. But we do still have a fake Delaware address. If it gives you any consolation.
Show of hands, does it upset people in the room when BetaKit covers a story and we say like Vancouver based instead of Burnaby based? Would you like, show of hands, would you like us to say Burnaby based? Metro Vancouver base? I don't know. Veto. Okay, hard veto.
To anyone outside of Vancouver, we need to appreciate it's Vancouver. So that's why we're not trying to deceive anyone. But
Okay. Do we want to? I'll do another. I'll do a Slido and then we'll work around the room. Okay. Maybe this is a great one that actually came up during the last panel, but I think we can speak to it here. Oh my God, Dylan, you've approved so many questions, I've lost it. Oh my God. Okay. I will just go. Oh, here it is. The panelists talked previously about non-dilutive funding, but the VCs here view non-dilutive funding as being detrimental to startups, not ambitious enough, etc. Your thoughts? And I would like you to go first, and then I have some thoughts that I'd like to share. But please, after that extensive outlaying of how you've approached venture capital, what are your thoughts on non-dilutive funding?
Well, I guess I think as an early stage founder, if you can find sources of non-dilutive funding, I would take that all day long, right? Like I can't think, and we can make this a dialogue. I'd be curious to hear what the argument against it would be. But I think if you can bootstrap off of revenue or bootstrap off of non-dilutive funding in a way that is not harming your velocity, and maybe that is the thing I would underscore the most, that in some cases getting non-dilutive funding can mean contorting yourself into a pretzel to fit the mold of whatever that funding source is trying to deliver capital to, and you're building the wrong thing. So I would say, with that major caveat aside, if you're not needing to do that and you can access non-dilutive capital, absolutely do that all day long. And that form of capital is also competitive to VC capital. So I would not be surprised, for a VC to take a stance against it. But at the same time, if you can take VC funding and accomplish the same thing with all the degrees of freedom that you might need as an early stage startup, and maybe get the thing done faster and get to market faster, I think you need to assess, like, well, maybe that dilution is worth it. And we had to take a healthy amount of dilution in the early days of Clio, and again, raising money in that kind of a financial crisis. And again, if things work well, that it all works out in the end. And I don't think you should get overly caught up worrying about dilution.
Yeah. One quick thing. So depending upon where you get the non-dilutive capital, like say for BDC requires a personal guarantee from the entrepreneurs for that, which is rough for a venture-backed business. But to your point, if you are using non-dilutive capital to try to spin your way out of not getting to the scale through the venture, you've just put yourself in position to sign away the rights and ownership of your company to the bankers. And while venture is a form of risk capital that acknowledges loss, the bankers don't mess around, and they will just take your business from you. So some of the companies that we are covering that are in zombie states are no longer able to justify the net new valuation of venture, secured debt capital to try and get out of it, and now they're on a different ticking clock.
Yeah.
The other side of that, though, is that when you talk to VCs about what is best, they are going to tell you about the methodology that works for them to get those returns in 10 years to offload their pressure. So if VCs are telling you that you need to build your business a certain way to get money from them, that's so that they can get a return on that investment. And I would suggest diversifying your portfolio of feedback, because I think too often we look to VCs as being the voice of how things are supposed to go versus one perspective on how they would like to get returns in this ecosystem. And part of the reason why we wanted to talk to a lot of founders today and fewer VCs on stage. Okay.
Yeah. And
Yep.
And just a minor aside on that, at Clio, over our entire fundraising history, although we've got access now to pretty significant lines of credit, we've never actually put $1 of debt to use, because the outcomes we see with debt just terrified me in the early days. And there's a few cautionary tales even in the Vancouver ecosystem of debt going the wrong way. So, I think, again, you need to make sure your interests and what you're trying to accomplish are aligned with whatever your funding source is, and understand what the consequences of not doing what you say you're going to do are going to be under those different scenarios. And there will be consequences, no matter what. It's just a matter of what they look like.
Absolutely. Okay. Next question.
I just want to ask a simple question. If you had started a company now in Vancouver in 2024, would you start in Vancouver? Why not? Why not?
Sorry, was the question why?
Would you start Clio in Vancouver in 2024?
If I had to do it all over again, would I start in Vancouver? Yeah, well, now my family's here. But joking aside, I think Vancouver is an incredible ecosystem. It's an incredible place to live. It's an incredible place, again, that connection. Maybe just to rewind, in 2008 when we started Clio, my co-founder Ryan was here, but I lived in Edmonton at the time, which is where I grew up, and I needed to make the decision. Ryan and I needed to make the decision. Do we found the company in Edmonton, or do we found it in Vancouver? Once we really started seeing the growth take off, we had to move away from being distributed and totally remote, and found an office and start hiring people. So we were kind of doing the remote work thing, way before it was cool in 2009, 2010. And the bake-off we did between basically Edmonton and Vancouver, and to a lesser extent Toronto, was looking at access to capital and access to talent. And I think Vancouver still scores super high on both of those fronts. The proximity to the Bay Area, I think makes, again, in 2012 when they invested, Bessemer was kind of the exception to the rule in that they invested out of the Bay Area. Now every VC, has an active thesis that great companies get built outside of the Bay Area. While some might have a preference for companies in their backyard, or certain classes of companies like maybe AI that they want built in a certain region, for every other type of company, they're willing to invest in you wherever you are. But they also don't want a connection, and they don't want to fly to cold places. So this is where Vancouver has, and as silly as that sounds, it's true. And again, thinking about that flywheel, like locate your place in your company in a place that has VCs traveling to it, that can tack on those afternoons and pay you a visit. And I think Vancouver scores super high on that metric. And then if you look at Toronto, I think if I was founding a company from scratch today, just being completely data-driven and metrics-driven, like Toronto has become just an incredible city. It's now grown into the third largest city in the US and Canada. There's something like 320,000 people in the IT sector that are available to hire in the labor market there. In Vancouver, we've got around a quarter of that. So it's an incredible place. You look at the number of HQs that are in Toronto. I'd take a really serious look at least having some presence there, if not your main office, just from a raw kind of access to talent and scaling opportunity.
You all have been rampantly upvoting some of the questions here, so I'm going to anchor on these. Just like round of applause. Everyone cool? We'll stick around for a few more minutes so we can answer a few more questions with Jack. Is that okay? Excellent. Peer approval. Okay, this is the most upvoted question that I can see, and I think it's a question that was for all the people we've had on stage today, but you're going to answer on behalf. Do you belong to a peer group? Where do you get your personal support and advice? Great question from Wayne Kerrigan. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that is a great question. So I've been recruited to many peer groups, or I should say maybe attempted to be recruited to many peer groups over the years. And I've never actually joined one, even though I see a lot of merit in many of these organizations, whether it's YPO, which I've now officially aged out of. I'm no longer young at 47. EO, there's a whole bunch, and I've not joined one for a few reasons. One is I'm lucky in that I've got a great network of CEO friends and founder friends that people that are maybe not even in the industry, but that I consider mentors that I've been able to connect to and learn from and talk through challenges. So I'd call it maybe a bit more of an ad hoc network on that front. And the other trade-off I've always struggled with a little bit is just the time. You know, I basically spend my time split, probably not evenly, but you know, I certainly prioritize my family, you know, and Clio as my two top priorities, and have found, you know, giving up time to other things something I'm super selective about, and I find I get a lot of energy from my family and the support I get there. I get a lot of support and energy from my friend network and from this ad hoc professional network, but have never formally joined a mentorship network.
I want to ask you if that was always the case, but I'm going to do it through Mike Togi's question, who is wondering how many times you've had to reinvent yourself to lead to this level. And I know in our prep call we were talking about like the things to keep in mind at 0 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 500, 500 plus employees, things like that. Like, was it always? Did you always have that balance? Did you have to look to insert that? How many times have you feel like you've had to reinvent this thing, or your approach to it?
Yeah. Well, a very early story for me was a discussion with my wife around the same time we were founding Clio, starting Clio, and she wanted to start a family, and this was, we both, you know, were aligned on that in the early days, but the question was when, and for me it was like, oh, we'll start a family someday, but it'll be after Clio's a success.
Down the road, yeah.
Down the road, like let's worry about that problem down the road. And you know what I realized really early was that Tanya asked me a question, which was, if not now, when? You know, like, you're starting a company, there's going to be a long road, this is going to take a long time to be successful. It's probably going to fail along the way, but should we hold off having a family? At that time, I'd kind of bought into this idea that the company needs to be everything, and a little bit of the like hustle culture around, you know, like you need to give up everything to make your company successful. And you know, I realized she was right. So you know, we ended up having our first child. His name is Ian. He's now 15, and he's about the same age as Clio. And we've had we've had we've had exactly 2 additional kids since having Ian. And what I found along the way was this whole idea, this whole like hustle culture notion was so wrong, like emphatically wrong, and that I found I got a huge amount of energy.
But Jack, founder mode.
Well, yeah, exactly, like founder mode.
Brian Chesky said founder mode, and Paul Graham wrote an essay about it.
I agree with some aspects of what Paul wrote in that essay, but I also think he's just categorically wrong on some aspects of that. And for me, a big part of that was family, and just finding the energy and the kind of renewal I get through family. Now there's also, and through my kids, like playing with my kids. Again, you go and sit down with your kid to read them a book at night, and they don't give a shit about what you shipped today. Like they just want a story from dad, and that's enormously regenerative. And that was something I found to be kind of a superpower over the last 15 years, is like I work hard, I do my best to get home for dinner every day, you know, or leave the office for dinner now that it's like more work from home. And that's given me a ton of energy.
Is it hard getting home to Delaware?
Yeah, no, this to 999 Canada Place, but
Okay.
and maybe my second comment around that would be on reinventing myself, maybe in the more professional context and running the company. You know, Clio's been a different job every quarter for the last 16 years, and it's been, I think, a high growth story of going from, you know, me and Ryan in the early days to now we're over 1,100 employees, and you know, adding more, you know, MRR in a day than we did in a year not so long ago. And you know, that I think has, I mean, it's challenged me to learn and to give up things, and to trust other people in absolute terms to run stuff that I need to distance myself from tremendously. And I think that founder, you talked about founder mode, like that was what I found such an interesting thing in that essay, where, you know, Paul's talking about like you need to get down into the details and kind of get in people's faces. I found that, you know, there's no way I could run a company of 1,200 people if I was getting down in the details on every single thing. Like, you need to hire great people and let them do great stuff and trust them and give them agency to do that. Whereas I think the premise of that essay was almost you're hiring shitty people, so you need to be up in their grill all the time.
You don't trust the people that you hire to do their jobs.
Right, exactly. And you know, you're just not hiring great people. I think if you hire, you should care about the right details. You should figure out what makes you tick as a founder and what stuff you want to stay close to, and then hire great people to do the stuff that doesn't fit that category. I think it's kind of as simple as that.
One more question, and then we will get back to like mixing and mingling, networking, and then we'll all try to convince Jack to come to the after party run by Toki, and maybe we can hang out and continue the conversation.
Sounds great.
I would be derelict of duty if I didn't ask this one. Jack, can you compare and contrast U.S. versus Canadian VCs?
U.S. versus Canadian VCs.
In 180 characters or less.
So I've got actually a pretty limited experience with Canadian VCs, only because early on in building Clio, we were kind of agnostic about where we were raising money from, and we took term sheets from both U.S. and Canadian VCs, and the term sheets we got from Canadian VCs were simply not competitive with what we were getting from the U.S. VCs, or we actually heard no from a bunch of both Canadian and U.S. VCs. But I've had a lot of calls with Canadian VCs over the last 5 years now, so like where Clio's their kind of number one, the one that got away story, and I take some small amount of satisfaction in hearing that. But we just found that it was surprising, like the mentality in Canada. Again, think about our flywheel and how do we build this? Like the mentality in Canada, and again, this is more like in the early 2010s, and I don't know if things have changed a lot in the last 10 years, to be honest, but at least my point in time reference was this expectation that as a Canadian VC, you're gonna get some kind of hometown discount on a Canadian company. And that's just not, like, people are laughing because it's like, that's ridiculous. Of course you don't. And if I get a better term sheet from a US-based VC, like survival takes precedent over any sense of patriotism. Like, I'm not gonna choose a Canadian VC that, in this case, had a lower valuation, more structure, you name it, more governance. I'm not gonna take that deal any day of the week. So I think that's my limited experience, and I think that what we looked to when we were choosing our investors was again not just based on terms, but who has a portfolio of companies that have gone through some flavor of what Clio's gone through, and I think that's actually one of the most powerful value adds that investors bring to the table that maybe most people don't appreciate. Is like capital's certainly one, and a clean term sheet that's number two, but something that is enormously valuable, even talking about back to that mentor network question, some of the most valuable things I've gained access to is kind of CEOs in the portfolio that have gone through some flavor of the journey we're about to go through, and can help me avoid accumulating scar tissue the hard way. Like they've got their own, and they can talk about the bumps they found along the way. And it just so happened with these rounds we've done, the US-based VCs, whether that was Bessemer, who was very early in on vertical SaaS with Service Titan and other companies like Clio, or our most recent investor, NEA, that value add component has been hard to quantify, but enormously valuable.
Successfully brought Cloudflare and Groupon public, which maybe is where you got your metrics on where you need to be to get there. I so appreciate how thoughtful and detailed you are in your responses, and like what you're willing to kind of share of this process in a very relaxed manner, no pressure. I could talk to you for hours. We got to wrap this. We want to do the next one at a Clio office somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. We're opening, I don't know if this is secret or not, we're opening a new Toronto office in about a month, so we could do it there. You heard it first here at the BetaKit town hall, but yeah, I'd love to. I feel like we got through like 20% of what we wanted to talk about.
I know.
It was great. Thank you. And thank you all for the great questions. I really enjoyed it. And let's do this more often.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.